The silence hit harder than the words themselves. 23 people around my grandmother's mahogany dining table, and you could have heard a pin drop on the antique Persian rug. My sister Catherine had just announced to our entire extended family that I was the family burden who never contributed anything meaningful to this world. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Easter ham sat half-carved on its silver platter, steam still rising. From the honey glaze that Grandma Rose had spent hours perfecting, Aunt Margaret's fork was frozen halfway to her mouth, a piece of scalloped potato balanced precariously on the tines. My cousin Derek's wife had her water glass pressed to her lips, but she wasn't drinking. Even the children had stopped their chatter. Catherine smoothed her navy blazer and continued, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes from someone who knows exactly where to strike. Jessica has been living off everyone else's success for years. Mom and Dad paid for her failed art degree, I covered her rent when she couldn't make it as a freelancer, and now she's working some nobody job at a startup that'll probably fold within a year. Meanwhile, my husband Marcus here just got promoted to senior vice president at Henderson & Associates. She gestured toward Marcus, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his pressed khakis. He managed a weak smile and reached for his wine glass, avoiding eye contact with everyone at the table. I sat there, my grandmother's good china feeling suddenly fragile in my hands, and realized that this moment would either break me or become the story I'd tell for the rest of my life about the day everything changed. But let me back up, because the woman sitting at that table in her simple black dress and costume jewelry wasn't the same person who would walk out of that house 3 hours later. That woman didn't know that in exactly 47 minutes, Marcus's phone would buzz with a text that would turn Catherine's perfectly orchestrated humiliation into the most expensive mistake of her life. 6 months earlier, I had been exactly who Catherine said I was. Jessica Marie Thompson, 28 years old, living in a studio apartment in Portland with a leaky ceiling and a radiator that sounded like a dying animal. My art degree from Pacific Northwest College had gotten me exactly what everyone predicted it would. A stack of rejection letters from galleries and a job serving overpriced coffee to people who looked right through me. My parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, had stopped asking about my art career around month 18 of my post-graduation job search. The conversations had shifted from supportive, "You just need to find the right opportunity, honey," to concern, "Maybe you should consider something more stable," to resigned silence. They never said they were disappointed, but I could feel it in the way Dad changed the subject when his golf buddies asked about his daughters, and how Mom's face would tighten when Catherine updated everyone on her latest promotion at her marketing firm. Catherine had always been the golden child. Valedictorian at Westlake High School, full scholarship to Stanford, MBA at 25, married to Marcus Wellington, who came from old Portland money and worked at the most prestigious consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest. She lived in a craftsman house in the Pearl District with hardwood floors that probably cost more than my annual salary. She drove a silver BMW that she'd paid for in cash, and she never let anyone forget it. The worst part wasn't that Catherine was successful. The worst part was that she was genuinely good at what she did. Her marketing campaigns had won awards. Her clients loved her. She had the corner office, the designer wardrobe, and the kind of confidence that made waiters apologize for things that weren't their fault. I wanted to hate her purely out of sibling rivalry, but the truth was more complicated than that. I was proud of her, and that made everything hurt worse. The gap between us had started small. Catherine was 2 years older, 2 years ahead in school, 2 years closer to figuring out her life. But small gaps have a way of becoming chasms when you're not paying attention. By the time I graduated college, Catherine was already climbing the corporate ladder while I was still trying to figure out which ladder to climb. The breaking point had come 8 months before that Easter dinner. I'd been behind on rent again, And my landlord, Mr. Peterson, had started leaving increasingly aggressive notes taped to my door. I swallowed my pride and called Catherine, knowing she'd say yes because that's what responsible older sisters do, but also knowing she'd never let me forget it. "How much?" she'd asked, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Just 1,500. I can pay you back in 3 months, I promise. I'm getting more freelance work, and there's this gallery that's interested in my series on urban decay." The pause had stretched long enough for me to hear her typing in the background, probably responding to emails while I begged for grocery money. "Fine. I'll transfer it tonight. But Jessica, this can't keep happening. You're almost 30. You need to figure out what you're actually going to do with your life." She'd sent the money, and I'd paid my rent, and for 3 months I'd felt the weight of that debt every time I saw her name in my phone. Not the financial debt. I'd paid that back on time, working extra shifts at the coffee shop and selling a few small paintings to tourists. The emotional debt was heavier. The debt of being the sister who needed saving. Catherine never mentioned the money directly after that, but it lived in the space between us. It was there in the way she'd ask about my job situation with air quotes in her voice. It was there when she'd suggest I look into more stable career paths at family gatherings. It was there in the way she'd introduce me to her friends as my sister Jessica, she's an artist, with the kind of smile that made it clear she thought that was a polite way of saying unemployed. The truth was, I'd started to believe her narrative about my life. When you hear something enough times, especially from someone whose opinion matters to you, it starts to sound like fact instead of judgment. Maybe I was a burden. Maybe my dreams were naive. Maybe it was time to give up on the idea that I could make a living doing something I loved. That's why I'd started looking for a different kind of job 3 months before Easter. Not because I'd stopped believing in my art, but because I'd stopped believing in my ability to survive as an artist. I'd updated my resume, highlighting my college marketing courses and playing down the art degree. I'd practiced talking about my transferable skills and my interest in exploring new industries. The interviews had been brutal, sitting in sterile conference rooms, explaining to people in expensive suits why a failed artist would be a good fit for their accounting department or their data entry team. Most of them had been polite but dismissive. A few had been openly skeptical. One hiring manager had actually asked me if I was serious about leaving the arts behind, or if I was just looking for something temporary until my real career took off. But then I'd gotten a call from someone named David Chen at a company called Meridian Solutions. The name hadn't meant anything to me, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be like the other interviews. David had sounded different on the phone. Younger, more energetic, less formal. "Jessica, I've been looking at your portfolio, and I have to say, your visual work is really interesting. We're not hiring for an art position, but I think you might have exactly the kind of creative problem-solving skills we need. Would you be interested in coming in to talk about a project coordinator role?" The office had been different too. Instead of corporate gray and fluorescent lighting, Meridian Solutions occupied a converted warehouse in the Southeast Division with exposed brick walls and skylights. The conference room where I'd met David had whiteboards covered in diagrams and sticky notes, and there was a coffee station that looked like it had been assembled from vintage equipment found at estate sales. David Chen had turned out to be exactly what he'd sounded like on the phone. Mid-30s, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that he'd obviously slept in, with the kind of excited energy that made you want to lean forward in your chair. He'd spent the first 20 minutes of our meeting not asking about my resume, but showing me the problems his company was trying to solve. "We work with mid-sized businesses that are stuck," he'd explained, pulling up slides on a laptop that was held together with electrical tape. "They've grown past the startup phase, but they're not big enough to have dedicated teams for everything they need. Marketing, logistics, technology integration, process optimization. They're trying to juggle all of these things without the resources to do any of them well." I nodded along, not entirely sure why he was telling me this instead of asking about my experience with project management software, or my 5-year career goals. The thing is, David had continued, most consultants come in with predetermined solutions. They've got a playbook, and they try to make every client fit the same template. But every business is different. Every problem is unique. What we need is someone who can look at a situation and see it from a completely different angle. Someone who can take a mess and turn it into something beautiful. That's when he'd pulled out printed copies of my art portfolio. Not the safe, commercial-friendly pieces I'd been showing to galleries, but the experimental work I'd posted on my personal website. Mixed media pieces that combined photography, painting, and found objects. Visual essays about abandoned buildings being reclaimed by nature. Colleges that told stories about urban renewal and community displacement. This piece here, he'd said, pointing to a photograph I'd taken of a warehouse being converted into condos, overlaid with paint and collaged elements. You took something that most people would see as urban blight and showed the story of transformation. You found beauty in a process that most people think is ugly. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. I'd left that interview with a job offer and a salary that was 30% higher than anything I'd been applying for. More importantly, I'd left with the feeling that someone had finally seen something in me that even I hadn't known was there. Meridian Solutions hadn't been lying when they said they worked with businesses that were stuck. Over the next 3 months, I'd found myself in warehouses and offices and retail spaces, talking to owners and managers who were drowning in problems they couldn't solve. But David had been right about the creative problem-solving part. Same skills I'd used to turn discarded materials into art, translated perfectly to turning operational chaos into streamlined systems. My first project was a small manufacturing company that made custom furniture. They'd been losing money on every order because they couldn't track their costs accurately. Instead of recommending expensive software or complicated spreadsheets, I'd spent a week on their factory floor, watching how materials moved through their process. Then I'd created a visual tracking system using color-coded tags and wall charts that let them see exactly where every piece of wood and every hour of labor was going. Within a month, they'd turned their first profit in 2 years. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The second project had been a family-owned restaurant chain that was expanding too fast to maintain quality control. I'd developed a training program that used visual storytelling techniques to help new employees understand not just what to do, but why it mattered. Instead of memorizing procedures, they were learning the story of the restaurant's values through interactive workshops that felt more like art classes than corporate training. By the time Easter rolled around, I'd worked on 6 different projects, and David had started using words like partnership track and equity stake in our conversations. But I hadn't told my family any of this. Part of it was professional caution. David had made it clear that Meridian was in the middle of some big negotiations and confidentiality was crucial. But most of it was personal protection. I'd been disappointed so many times, had so many things that seemed promising fall apart, that I'd learned to keep my hopes private until they became undeniable realities. And there was something else. I'd wanted to prove to myself that I could succeed without my family's approval or encouragement. If it worked out, I wanted to know that I'd done it entirely on my own. So when Catherine had asked about my job situation in the weeks leading up to Easter, I'd given her the same vague answers I'd been giving for months. It's going well. The company is growing. I'm learning a lot. I hadn't mentioned the projects or the praise or the conversations about my future with the company. I'd let her keep thinking of me as her struggling little sister, partly because it was easier than explaining something I wasn't sure I understood myself, and partly because some small, petty part of me wanted to see how far she'd push the narrative. I hadn't expected her to push it all the way to a public humiliation at our grandmother's Easter table. But sitting there, watching 23 members of my extended family process Catherine's announcement that I was the family failure, I realized that this moment was either going to destroy me or become the foundation of everything that came next. The old Jessica might have stood up and left. The old Jessica might have started crying or shouting or defending herself with weak protests about how hard she was trying. But the Jessica who had spent the last 3 months solving problems that stumped business owners with decades of experience, the Jessica who had started to see herself as someone who could take chaos and turn it into something beautiful, that Jessica did something different. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and smiled. "You're absolutely right, Catherine," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I haven't contributed anything meaningful to this world yet, but that's about to change." My smile seemed to throw Catherine off balance, but only for a moment. She recovered quickly, that practiced corporate composure sliding back into place, like armor. "Oh, really? And what exactly is about to change, Jessica? Are you finally going to admit that this whole artist thing was a phase and look for actual career opportunities?" The dining room felt smaller suddenly, as if the weight of everyone's attention was pressing the walls inward. I could smell my grandmother's lavender perfume mixing with the honey glaze from the ham, and could hear the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, marking time with deliberate precision. These were the details I would remember later, when this moment became a story I told about the day my life split into before and after. But Catherine wasn't finished. She'd found her rhythm now, the same tone she used when presenting quarterly reports to boardrooms full of executives who were paid to be impressed by confidence and spreadsheets. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," she continued, cutting her ham with surgical precision. "And I realize that part of the problem is that our family has been too supportive of unrealistic expectations. We've encouraged Jessica to pursue this art career without ever asking the hard questions about market viability or financial sustainability." My cousin Derek nodded thoughtfully. Derek worked in insurance and had strong opinions about risk assessment. "Catherine has a point. The creative industries are notoriously unstable. Even successful artists struggle with inconsistent income." "Exactly," Catherine said, warming to her theme. "And the startup world isn't much better. These small companies come and go so quickly. Jessica, can you honestly tell me that you have job security at this place you're working? Do you know what their revenue projections look like? Their client retention rates?" I took another sip of water, buying time to consider my response. The truth was, I knew Meridian's numbers better than most employees knew their own companies. Financials. I'd seen the quarterly reports, the growth projections, the client testimonials. I knew that our revenue had increased by 340% over the past 18 months, that we had a 95% client retention rate, and that David had been turning away potential projects because we couldn't scale fast enough to meet demand. But there was something else Catherine didn't know. 2 weeks earlier, I'd sat in David's office while he showed me documents that would fundamentally change how I thought about my future. "Jessica, I need to show you something," David had said, pulling up a confidential email on his computer. "We got an inquiry last month from a company that wants to explore a strategic partnership. Not just hiring us for a project, but bringing Meridian in as long-term operational partners." The email had been from Henderson and Associates, Marcus's company. The same firm that Catherine had been name-dropping at family gatherings for the past 2 years. The same one that had just made Marcus a senior vice president. "They've been watching our work," David had explained. "Apparently, one of their clients mentioned the Cascade manufacturing turnaround, and they started researching our other projects. They're impressed by our results, but more importantly, they're interested in our approach." I'd listened as David explained that Henderson and Associates was looking for a consulting partner that could deliver the kind of creative problem-solving that larger firms couldn't provide. They wanted innovation, not just implementation. They wanted solutions that were designed specifically for each client's unique challenges, not generic templates adapted from previous projects. "The thing is," David had continued, "they want to meet with our lead strategist before they commit to anything. They've been burned by consulting firms that promise customized solutions but deliver cookie-cutter approaches. They want to know that the person designing their client's solutions has the vision and expertise to deliver transformational results. That's when he'd offered me the promotion to Director of Strategic Solutions. Not just a title change, but partnership equity in Meridian's future growth. My name would go on the door, my vision would guide the company's strategic direction, and my first assignment would be presenting to Henderson and Associates on Tuesday morning, the day after Easter. But sitting at my grandmother's table, listening to Catherine explain why I was destined for professional failure, I hadn't planned to reveal any of this information. I'd wanted to wait until after the Henderson meeting, until the partnership was officially signed, until I could announce my success as an accomplished fact rather than a pending opportunity. Catherine was still building her case. The other thing is, Jessica has never really learned how to network effectively. In business, relationships matter just as much as skills. You need to be able to connect with decision makers, understand industry trends, and position yourself strategically within your field. My Aunt Margaret, who'd worked in pharmaceutical sales for 15 years, nodded approvingly. Catherine's absolutely right. I've seen so many talented people plateau in their careers because they didn't understand the importance of professional relationships. That's why Marcus has been so successful at Henderson, Catherine continued. He didn't just focus on doing good work. He built relationships with senior partners, got involved in industry organizations, and made himself visible to the people who make promotion decisions. Marcus was studying the centerpiece with unusual intensity, rotating his wine glass between his fingers. I'd known Marcus for 6 years, since he and Catherine had started dating, and I'd never seen him look uncomfortable with Catherine's praise before. Usually he basked in her descriptions of his professional achievements like a cat stretching in a sunny window. Marcus has worked on some really high-profile projects, Catherine said. Major operational overhauls for Fortune 500 companies. Strategic planning initiatives that affected thousands of employees. That's the kind of experience that builds real expertise. What kind of projects? I asked, genuinely curious. Marcus looked up from the centerpiece, seeming startled by the direct question. Oh, the usual consulting work. Process optimization, systems integration, organizational restructuring. But what industries? What kinds of problems were you solving? Catherine answered before Marcus could respond. Marcus works with all kinds of businesses. Manufacturing, retail, technology companies. Henderson and Associates has a very diverse client base. I was asking Marcus, I said gently. An odd silence settled over the table. Marcus cleared his throat and reached for the dinner rolls, even though he hadn't finished the one already on his plate. Well, recently I've been working mostly with mid-size manufacturing clients, he said slowly. Companies that have grown, beyond the startup phase, but aren't large enough to have dedicated teams for every function they need. I felt something cold and electric run down my spine. What kinds of challenges were they facing? The usual stuff. Inefficient processes, communication breakdowns between departments, difficulty scaling operations to meet growing demand. Marcus was speaking more quickly now, as if he wanted to get through this conversation as fast as possible. A lot of these companies get stuck because they're trying to solve 2020's problems with 1980s systems. And what solutions were you recommending? Catherine was watching this exchange with growing irritation. Jessica, why are you interrogating Marcus about his work? This isn't a job interview. But Marcus continued answering. Mostly technology solutions, enterprise software implementations, digital workflow systems, automated reporting structures. The standard approaches for modernizing operations. And how were those working out? Marcus hesitated. Mixed results, honestly. The technology usually worked as advertised, but the implementation timelines were longer than expected, and employee adoption was often challenging. My grandmother Rose, who'd been listening to this conversation while quietly arranging and rearranging the items on her plate, suddenly spoke up. Marcus, dear, You don't sound very enthusiastic about your work. Catherine's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Grandma, Marcus loves his job. He just got promoted to senior vice president. I didn't say he doesn't love his job, Rose replied with the precision of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching teenagers to think clearly. I said he doesn't sound enthusiastic about it. There's a difference. Marcus looked directly at my grandmother. And for the first time all evening, his expression seemed completely genuine. You're very perceptive, Mrs. Patterson. The truth is, I sometimes wonder if we're solving the right problems. A lot of our clients come to us because they're struggling with issues that seem like they should have straightforward solutions, but we tend to recommend these complex, expensive overhauls that take years to implement and require extensive training. Catherine's jaw tightened. Marcus, those comprehensive solutions are exactly why Henderson has such a strong reputation. Anyone can recommend quick fixes. It takes real expertise to design sustainable, scalable improvements. I know that's the company line, Marcus said quietly. But sometimes I think what these businesses really need is someone who can see their problems from a completely different angle. Someone who understands that not every solution has to involve six-figure software, licenses, and 18-month implementation timelines. My Uncle Frank, who owned a small plumbing business, leaned forward with interest. You know, that sounds exactly like what happened to my buddy Jim. He hired some big consulting firm to help streamline his auto parts operation. They sold him this expensive inventory management system that was supposed to revolutionize his business. 2 years and $50,000 later, his employees still couldn't figure out how to use it properly. What did he end up doing? I asked. Found some young consultant who came in and solved the whole problem in 3 weeks using a combination of simple software and better workflow design. Cost him about 5% of what the first firm charged, and it actually worked. Marcus nodded emphatically. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that work with human nature, instead of trying to force people to adapt to overly complicated systems. Catherine was looking back and forth between Marcus and Frank like they were speaking a foreign language. You're talking about Band-Aid solutions, quick fixes that don't address underlying structural issues. Are they quick fixes if they actually solve the problem? Marcus asked. I mean, if a simple solution works better than a complex one, why is simple automatically considered inferior? My cousin Sarah, who worked as a nurse and had strong opinions about practical versus theoretical approaches, jumped into the conversation. Marcus is right. In healthcare, we see this all the time. Some of the most effective treatments are surprisingly simple, but doctors sometimes resist them because they seem too easy to be legitimate medicine. That's completely different, Catherine said, her voice gaining an edge that I recognized from our childhood arguments. Healthcare and business consulting aren't comparable. Why not? Sarah asked. Both fields involve diagnosing problems and implementing solutions. Both require understanding complex systems and human behavior. I watched this exchange with growing fascination. This was the first time I'd ever seen anyone in our family challenge Catherine's professional expertise, and it was clear that she wasn't handling the pushback well. Because, Catherine said, speaking slowly as if she were explaining something obvious to a child, business transformation requires comprehensive analysis of interconnected systems. You can't just treat symptoms, you have to address root causes through systematic restructuring. But what if the root cause is that the existing system is unnecessarily complicated? Marcus asked. What if the best restructuring is actually simplification? Catherine stared at her husband like he'd announced he was joining the circus. Marcus, where is this coming from? You've never expressed these concerns before. I've been thinking about it more lately, Marcus said. Especially after hearing about this boutique consulting firm that's been getting incredible results, with exactly the kind of approach I'm talking about. Creative problem solving, human-centered design, solutions that work with existing culture, instead of trying to replace it. The room had gone very quiet. Even the children at the kids' table had paused their conversation about Easter egg hunting to listen to the adults argue about business consulting. "What firm?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. Marcus looked directly at me. "Meridian Solutions. They've been doing some amazing work with mid-size businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest. Have you heard of them?" The question hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Marcus was looking at me expectantly, waiting for my answer about whether I'd heard of Meridian Solutions, while Catherine was staring at him with the kind of controlled fury that meant someone was about to pay for disrupting her carefully orchestrated narrative. "Actually," I said, setting down my water glass with deliberate precision, "I work for Meridian Solutions." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the polite quiet of people pausing their conversation, but the complete absence of sound that happens when an entire room collectively stops breathing. My grandmother's antique clock seemed to tick louder, marking seconds that felt like hours. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions so quickly it was like watching a time-lapse video of weather patterns. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked like panic. Catherine's fork clattered against her plate. "What did you just say?" "I work for Meridian Solutions," I repeated, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I'm their Director of Strategic Solutions." "That's impossible," Catherine said flatly. "You work for some startup nobody's heard of. You told me you were doing project coordination." "I told you I was working as a project coordinator when I first started there 3 months ago. Things have changed since then." Marcus had gone completely pale. He was staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly a superhero, which, given the circumstances, wasn't that far from how this felt. "Wait," he said slowly. "You're saying you work for the Meridian Solutions. That did the Cascade Manufacturing turnaround? The one that's been getting all the industry attention?" "The same one." Catherine's eyes were moving back and forth between Marcus and me, trying to process this information. "Marcus, how do you know about this company? You never mentioned them before tonight." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. He looked like someone who'd just realized he'd been walking through a minefield in the dark. "Catherine, there's something I should probably tell you." "What?" "Henderson and Associates has been in talks with Meridian Solutions about a strategic partnership. I've been part of the evaluation team reviewing their work for the past month. If..." The silence after my announcement had been complete. This one was apocalyptic. Catherine's face had gone from flushed to pale to a shade of red that reminded me of the time she'd gotten food poisoning from bad shrimp. "You've been what?" Her voice had dropped to the kind of whisper that was more terrifying than shouting. "I've been reviewing their case studies, analyzing their methodologies, preparing recommendations for the senior partners about whether Henderson should pursue a formal partnership agreement." Catherine stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Let me get this straight. While I've been sitting here explaining to everyone why Jessica is a professional failure, you've been secretly evaluating her company as a potential business partner." The dining room had become a theater, and everyone was watching the drama unfold with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for car accidents. My cousin Derek was holding his fork suspended in mid-air. My Aunt Margaret had her napkin pressed to her mouth like she was trying to prevent herself from gasping out loud. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand what. Marcus was fumbling with his phone, scrolling through what looked like email messages. "Catherine, I didn't know Jessica worked there. She never told us the name of her company. You kept saying she worked for some nobody startup, so I never made the connection." "What connection?" Catherine's voice was getting higher. "What exactly have you been telling them about this company?" Marcus swallowed hard. "I recommended that Henderson move forward with the partnership." The sound Catherine made was somewhere between a laugh and a scream. "You recommended that your company partner with the startup where my sister works?" The same sister you just sat there listening to me call a professional failure? I didn't know. What did you tell them? What did you say in your evaluation? Marcus looked down at his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be an email thread. I said that Meridian Solutions had demonstrated exceptional ability to deliver transformational results for mid-sized businesses using innovative approaches that larger consulting firms couldn't replicate. My grandmother Rose was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who'd seen every possible variety of human drama during her 84 years on Earth. She reached for her wine glass and took a delicate sip, as if she were settling in to enjoy the show. What else? Catherine demanded. Marcus continued reading from his phone. I said that their lead strategist had developed methodologies that consistently delivered better outcomes in shorter timeframes than traditional consulting approaches. I said that their track record suggested they could help Henderson's clients achieve sustainable operational improvements without the typical implementation challenges that plague large-scale technology overhauls. Their lead strategist, Catherine repeated slowly. Who is their lead strategist, Marcus? Marcus looked up from his phone and stared directly at me. According to the company information Henderson received, it's Jessica Thompson. Catherine sat back down in her chair like someone had cut the strings holding her upright. For a moment, she just stared at me, and I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about my life, my career, and apparently her own marriage. How long have you known about this partnership discussion? She asked Marcus. About 6 weeks. Henderson reached out to Meridian in early February. I've been part of the evaluation team since the beginning of March. And in 6 weeks? It never occurred to you to mention that you were reviewing a company for potential partnership. Catherine, you know I can't discuss confidential business, negotiations, even with you. But you can sit there and let me humiliate myself by attacking the professional credibility of someone your company is trying to hire? My cousin Sarah, who'd been following this conversation like a tennis match, suddenly spoke up. Wait, so Jessica's company is successful enough that Marcus's firm wants to partner with them? Marcus nodded miserably. Henderson has been looking for a boutique consulting partner for over a year. Most of the firms we evaluated either couldn't deliver the kind of innovative solutions our clients need, or they were too small to handle the volume of work we wanted to send them. Meridian was the first company that met all our criteria. What criteria? I asked, genuinely curious about how Henderson had been evaluating potential partners. Marcus looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Proven track record of creative problem-solving, ability to deliver measurable results quickly, experience working with businesses similar to Henderson's client base, strong leadership with vision for scalable growth. He paused. And most importantly, someone who could think outside traditional consulting frameworks to develop solutions that actually worked in real-world business environments. Catherine was staring at Marcus like he'd announced he was from Mars. And Jessica meets all those criteria? According to everything we've reviewed, yes, her case studies are remarkable. The Cascade manufacturing project alone saved that company from bankruptcy and turned them profitable in 6 weeks. The restaurant chain project improved employee retention by 75% and customer satisfaction by 60%. The furniture manufacturer project increased profit margins by 40% while reducing production time by half. I felt a surge of pride hearing Marcus describe my work, even under these surreal circumstances. But I could also see Catherine processing this information, and I knew her well enough to recognize the look that meant she was searching for a way to regain control of the narrative. Okay, she said, her voice taking on the measured tone she used when negotiating with difficult clients. Let's say this is all true. Let's say Jessica has been more successful than she's told us. That still doesn't change the fact that she hasn't been honest with her family about her career situation. Catherine, I started. No, let me finish. You sat there for months letting everyone think you were struggling professionally. You let me worry about your financial stability. You let Mom and Dad think they needed to help you figure out your career direction. You made us all feel sorry for you while you were apparently building some successful consulting business. The accusation hit harder than I'd expected. There was truth in what Catherine was saying, even though she was missing crucial context. I had let my family continue thinking I was struggling, partly for professional confidentiality reasons, but partly because I'd wanted to protect myself from their expectations and opinions while I figured out what I was actually capable of achieving. "You're right," I said. "I should have told you about the promotion and the partnership opportunity. But, Catherine, can you honestly tell me that you would have been supportive? Can you tell me that you wouldn't have found ways to minimize my success, or explain why it was temporary or accidental?" Catherine opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. The dining room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. "In the kitchen." "Because," I continued, 30 minutes ago, you stood up in front of our entire family and announced that I was a burden who had never contributed anything meaningful to the world. You said I was a professional failure who needed to accept reality and find a real job. You said this while your husband was preparing to recommend that his company enter into a strategic partnership with the business I've spent the last 3 months building. Marcus was scrolling through his phone again, and his expression was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. "Catherine, there's something else." "What now?" "The partnership meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Henderson's executive team is meeting with Meridian's Director of Strategic Solutions to finalize the agreement." Catherine stared at him. "Tomorrow?" 9 a.m. I'm supposed to be there for the final presentation. "So you're telling me that tomorrow morning, you're going to be sitting in a conference room with my sister, who you just spent the last month evaluating without knowing who she was, to discuss a business partnership that could potentially change both of your careers?" Marcus nodded weakly. Catherine stood up again, this time more slowly, and looked around the table at our assembled family members. Everyone was watching her with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for potentially dangerous animals. "So let me make sure I understand this situation," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I just spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone why Jessica is a professional disappointment, while my husband sat there knowing that his company considers her talented enough to bet their reputation on her success. I called her a burden while she was apparently building exactly the kind of career that I've been telling everyone represents real professional achievement. And now tomorrow, Marcus is going to have to sit across from Jessica and pretend that this dinner conversation never happened while they negotiate a business deal that will determine the future direction of both their companies. That's accurate," Marcus said quietly. Catherine looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something that looked almost like fear. "Jessica," she said, "what exactly are you going to tell Henderson and Associates about this conversation?" Catherine's question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. What was I going to tell Henderson and Associates about this conversation? The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that I could feel it like a change in atmospheric pressure. 20 minutes ago, I'd been the family disappointment being publicly dressed down at Easter dinner. Now, I hold the professional future of my brother-in-law in my hands. I looked around the table at 23 faces, all waiting for my response. Some looked fascinated, others uncomfortable, but everyone understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about at family gatherings for years to come. My grandmother Rose was watching me with particular intensity, and I could see something in her expression that looked like pride mixed with curiosity about what I would do with this unexpected power. "Catherine," I said finally, "I'm not going to tell Henderson and Associates anything about this conversation." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. "Thank you. I'm not finished." My voice carried an authority I'd never used with my family before, the same tone I'd developed over months of presenting solutions to skeptical business owners. "I'm not going to tell them about this conversation because it's not relevant to our business relationship. But I am going to conduct that meeting as a professional who expects to be treated with the same respect I would show any potential partner. Marcus nodded rapidly. Of course, absolutely. Jessica, I want you to know that my evaluation of Meridian was based entirely on your company's track record and capabilities. This personal situation doesn't change my professional assessment at all. Good, I said. Because tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I'm not going to be Catherine's little sister who used to need rent money. I'm going to be Director of Strategic Solutions for a consulting firm that Henderson and Associates specifically sought out because you need what we can provide. Catherine was studying her plate like she was memorizing the pattern on the china. Jessica, I owe you an apology. Yes, you do. The directness of my response seemed to surprise her. She looked up, and I could see her recalculating how to handle this conversation, now that she wasn't operating from a position of assumed superiority. I shouldn't have said those things about your career. I was out of line, and I'm sorry. I took a moment to consider her apology. It was more than I'd expected, but less than what the situation actually required. Catherine, you didn't just criticize my career. You stood up in front of our entire family and announced that I was a burden who had never contributed anything meaningful to the world. You did that without knowing anything about what I've actually been doing for the past 3 months. You're right. You made assumptions about my professional capabilities based on what you wanted to believe rather than what you bothered to find out. And you did it publicly, in a way that was designed to humiliate me in front of people whose opinions matter to me. Catherine was nodding, but I could see her struggling with the unfamiliar experience of being held accountable by her little sister. I was wrong. I should have asked more questions before making those statements. But here's what I find most interesting, I continued, settling into the kind of systematic analysis I'd learned to use when helping clients understand the root causes of their operational problems. You weren't just wrong about the facts. You were wrong about what success actually looks like. My Uncle Frank, who'd been following this conversation while working on his 3rd dinner roll, leaned forward with interest. What do you mean? Catherine spent 20 minutes explaining that real professional success means working for established companies with traditional career tracks, predictable advancement timelines, and corporate benefits packages. She used Marcus's position at Henderson as the gold standard for what professional achievement should look like. Marcus was looking increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair like someone who'd realized he was sitting on something sharp. But if that's true, I continued, then why is Henderson and Associates looking for a strategic partner? Why are they specifically seeking out a boutique consulting firm that takes creative approaches to problem solving? Why are they interested in working with someone who doesn't follow traditional consulting frameworks? Catherine opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. The answer, I said, is that Henderson's traditional approach isn't solving their clients' problems as effectively as they need it to. Marcus, you said it yourself. A lot of your clients come to you with issues that seem like they should have straightforward solutions, but Henderson recommends complex, expensive overhauls that take years to implement. Marcus nodded slowly. That's been a source of frustration for me lately. And that frustration is exactly why Henderson reached out to Meridian. They need solutions that work with human nature instead of against it. They need approaches that deliver results quickly, rather than just looking impressive in PowerPoint presentations. They need someone who can see problems from a completely different perspective. My cousin Sarah was listening with the intensity of someone watching a masterclass in professional analysis. So, Jessica, you're saying that your non-traditional background is actually an advantage. I'm saying that the skills I developed as an artist, seeing patterns that others miss, finding creative solutions to complex problems, understanding how different elements work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts, those skills translate directly to business consulting. My grandmother Rose spoke up for the first time since the revelation. Jessica, tell us about one of your projects. Help us understand what you actually do. I glanced around the table, realizing that this was the first time anyone in my family had asked me to describe my work in detail rather than just asking when I was going to find something more stable. The Cascade Manufacturing Project, I said. Patricia Cascade inherited a lumber processing business from her father, but the company was losing money on every order because they couldn't track their costs accurately or manage their workflow efficiently. Marcus was listening with particular attention, and I realized he'd probably read my case study as part of his evaluation process. Most consulting firms would have recommended enterprise software solutions, new inventory management, systems, digital workflow platforms. That's exactly what Henderson would typically suggest, right, Marcus? He nodded. That would be our standard approach for operational inefficiencies. But I spent 2 weeks living in Bend, Oregon, documenting every step of their process from raw timber delivery to finished product shipping. I interviewed truck drivers, machine operators, and quality control supervisors. I asked them not just what they did, but what frustrated them about how they had to do it. My father, Robert, who'd spent 26 years in manufacturing before his forced retirement, was leaning forward with genuine interest. What did you find? I found that the employees already knew exactly what the problems were and had ideas for how to fix them, but nobody had ever asked them. The drivers knew which delivery routes were inefficient. The machine operators knew which equipment needed maintenance before it broke down. The quality control team knew which suppliers delivered inconsistent materials. So, what did you do? Asked my cousin Derek. I created a visual tracking system that let everyone see how their work connected to the final product and the customer's satisfaction. Instead of expensive software, I used colored tags and wall charts that made sense to people who'd been working with wood and machinery for decades. Marcus was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language he was only beginning to understand. And that worked? Order accuracy up 85%. Delivery time cut in half. Customer complaints are down to nearly zero. Most importantly, employee satisfaction improved because everyone could see how their work mattered. How long did this take? Catherine asked quietly. 6 weeks from initial assessment to full implementation, and it cost about 5% of what a traditional enterprise software solution would have required. The dining room was quiet except for the sound of my grandmother's clock marking time. I could see people processing this information, trying to reconcile the Jessica they thought they knew with the professional I was describing. But here's the thing that Henderson found most interesting, I continued. Patricia Cascade started, referring new clients to Meridian within a month. Her success story got David invited to speak at industry conferences. Word traveled throughout the Pacific Northwest business community that there was a consulting firm that could deliver transformational results without the typical implementation headaches. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like his email. Jessica, I have your case study right here. I've read it probably 10 times over the past month. What was your assessment? I told the Henderson partners that your approach represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking we needed to offer our clients. I said that traditional consulting had become too focused on impressing clients with complex solutions rather than actually solving their problems. Catherine was looking back and forth between Marcus and me like she was watching a conversation in a language she didn't speak. Marcus, you never told me you had concerns about Henderson's methodologies. Because you've always been so proud of my position there. You've made Henderson's reputation such a central part of how you talk about our success that I didn't want to admit I was having doubts about whether we were actually helping our clients as much as we could be. I watched Catherine process this information. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain about her own professional judgment. Marcus, I said, can I ask you something about tomorrow's meeting? Of course. What outcome are you hoping for? Not what Henderson wants, but what you personally think would be the best result. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Honestly, I hope Henderson moves forward with the partnership. I think Meridian could help us deliver better results for our clients, and I think working with your team could help me become better at what I do. Why? Because you've figured out how to solve problems that we struggle with. You understand something about business transformation that I'm still learning. You see opportunities where we see obstacles. Catherine was watching this exchange with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or frustration, but something that looked almost like confusion. "Marcus," she said slowly, "are you saying that you want to learn from Jessica?" "I'm saying that Jessica has developed expertise that could make me better at my job, yes." Catherine turned to me. "Jessica, what do you want from tomorrow's meeting?" I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Professional success, obviously. Recognition for the work I'd been doing. Validation that my non-traditional approach had. Value in the business world. But there was something else. Something more personal. I want Henderson to understand that Meridian isn't just a vendor they're hiring to handle overflow work. We're strategic partners who can help them solve problems they haven't been able to solve on their own. I want them to see that our different perspective isn't a limitation. It's exactly what their clients need. "And what do you want from our family?" The question caught me off guard. I looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life, people who'd watched me struggle and stumble and apparently succeed without realizing it. "I want you to stop assuming that different means are wrong," I said finally. "I want you to ask questions before making judgments. And I want you to understand that there are many different ways to build a meaningful career and a successful life." My grandmother Rose raised her wine glass. "To Jessica," she said clearly, "who taught us all something important today about the difference between looking successful and being successful." One by one, the rest of the family raised their glasses. Even Catherine, though she looked like she was still processing everything that had happened. "To Jessica," they said, but as I raised my own glass, I realized that tomorrow's meeting would determine whether this family dinner had been a turning point or just an interesting conversation. Because in 12 hours, I would be sitting across from Marcus and his colleagues, and everything I'd said about my professional capabilities would be put to the test. The Henderson and Associates building was a monument to corporate success. 37 floors of glass and steel reaching toward the Portland sky like a middle finger to anyone who thought small businesses mattered. I stood on the sidewalk at 8:45 a.m., briefcase in hand, wearing my one good suit and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, with the kind of expensive emptiness that was designed to make visitors feel small. But I wasn't feeling small. I was feeling like someone who'd spent the night preparing for the most important presentation of her career. Someone who'd woken up at 5 a.m. to review case studies and practice explaining why Meridian Solutions was exactly what Henderson and Associates needed. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor gave me 2 minutes to think about what had happened after I'd left my grandmother's house the night before. Catherine had cornered me in the driveway, her face pale in the porch light, asking one more time if I was going to mention the dinner conversation in my presentation. "Catherine," I'd told her, "what you said at dinner doesn't change anything about tomorrow's meeting. But what happens in tomorrow's meeting might change everything about how our family works." Now, walking through Henderson's reception area with its floor-to-ceiling windows and abstract art that probably cost more than my annual salary, I understood what Catherine had been so afraid of. This wasn't just a business meeting. This was the moment when everyone would find out whether Jessica Thompson was actually capable of operating at the level Marcus had been describing to his colleagues for the past month. The conference room was exactly what I'd expected. A 20-foot table, leather chairs, smart boards on every wall, and enough technology to run a small city. 5 people were already seated when I arrived, including Marcus, who looked like he hadn't slept much either. "Jessica," said a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a handshake that could crack walnuts. "I'm Linda Brennan, managing partner. We're very excited to meet you." She introduced the rest of the team. James Crawford, senior partner for operations, Rebecca Martinez, director of client relations, Kevin Wu, head of strategic planning, and Marcus, whose official title was Senior Vice President of Business Development. Everyone was impeccably dressed, professionally polite, and radiating the kind of competence that made Fortune 500 companies pay premium rates for their advice. "Before we begin," Linda said, settling into her chair at the head of the table, "I want you to know that Marcus has given us glowing reports about Meridian's work. His evaluation was one of the most enthusiastic recommendations I've seen in 20 years of reviewing potential partnerships." I glanced at Marcus, who was staring at his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. The weight of last night's dinner conversation was sitting between us like an elephant in designer clothing. "Marcus has been particularly impressed by your approach to problem solving," James Crawford added. "He suggested that your methodologies could help us serve our clients more effectively." "I appreciate Marcus's confidence," I said, opening my laptop and connecting to the room's presentation system. "But I'd prefer to let our results speak for themselves." For the next 45 minutes, I walked them through Meridian's case studies, with the kind of detailed analysis I'd never been able to share with my family. I showed them before and after photos of the businesses we'd transformed, spreadsheets documenting improved efficiency metrics, and client testimonials that read like love letters to creative problem solving. But more importantly, I showed them something they hadn't expected: a systematic methodology for turning chaos into clarity that could be scaled and replicated across different industries and business sizes. "The key insight," I explained, clicking through slides that showed the visual tracking system I'd developed for Cascade Manufacturing, "is that most operational problems aren't actually technology problems. They're communication problems disguised as technology problems." Rebecca Martinez leaned forward with interest. "Can you elaborate on that?" "Traditional consulting assumes that if you give people better tools, they'll automatically use them more effectively. But tools don't solve problems if people don't understand why they're using them or how their individual work connects to larger organizational goals." I pulled up a photo of Patricia Cascade's factory floor, showing the color-coded tracking system that had transformed their operations. "This looks simple, but it requires understanding how lumber processing actually works, how the employees think about their daily tasks, and what information they need to make better decisions in real time." Kevin Wu was taking notes on a tablet, his fingers moving fast enough to suggest he was capturing more than just bullet points. "Jessica, how do you scale this kind of personalized approach? Our clients range from mid-size manufacturers to retail chains with hundreds of locations. The same way you scale any successful methodology, by identifying the underlying principles that work across different contexts and teaching other people how to apply them." I clicked to the next slide, which showed a framework I'd developed over months of trial and error. Every business transformation project follows the same basic pattern. Listen first, understand the existing culture, identify the real problems versus the perceived problems, design solutions that work with human nature instead of against it, and implement changes incrementally so people can adapt successfully. "But that's exactly what we do," James Crawford said, though he sounded less certain than his words suggested. "Is it?" I asked gently. "Marcus, based on your experience with Henderson's typical client engagements, how much time do you usually spend on job sites or factory floors before recommending solutions?" Marcus looked up from his hands for the first time since introductions. "Usually, we conduct stakeholder interviews and review existing documentation before developing our recommendations." "How long do those interviews typically last?" 2 to 3 hours per stakeholder, depending on their role in the organization." "And how many stakeholders do you usually interview?" 5 to 10, typically the senior management team and department heads." I nodded. For the Cascade Manufacturing project, I spent 80 hours on their factory floor over 2 weeks. I interviewed 37 employees, from truck drivers to quality control supervisors. I documented their existing processes by watching them work, not by asking them to describe their work. The room was very quiet. Linda Brennan was studying me with the expression of someone who was recalculating everything she thought she knew about business consulting. "Jessica," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that Henderson's approach is inadequate?" "I'm suggesting that Henderson's approach works well for certain types of problems, but struggles with others. When clients need comprehensive technology, overhauls, or organizational restructuring, your traditional methodologies are probably exactly what they need. But when clients need creative solutions to operational challenges, a more immersive approach might be more effective." Rebecca Martinez was flipping through printed copies of our case studies. "These results are remarkable. But Jessica, how do we know they're sustainable? How do we know these improvements will last after you've completed the engagement?" It was a smart question, the kind that separated serious business partners from consultants who were just trying to impress potential clients with flashy presentations. "Patricia Cascade's company has maintained their improved efficiency metrics for 8 months since we completed our engagement," I said. "But more importantly, they've continued to adapt and improve their processes using the frameworks we taught them. They don't need us to come back every time they face a new challenge." I clicked on a slide showing follow-up data from all 6 of our completed projects. Sustainable improvement happens when you teach people how to solve problems, not just when you solve problems for them. Kevin Wu looked up from his note-taking. "That's a very different philosophy from most consulting engagements. Most consulting engagements are designed to create dependency rather than independence. Clients pay premium rates for solutions they can't implement or maintain without ongoing support. Our approach is designed to make ourselves unnecessary as quickly as possible." Marcus finally spoke up. "Jessica, can you tell them about your restaurant chain project? I think it illustrates your point about teaching versus doing." I pulled up the case study for Bella Vista Family Restaurants, a local chain that had been struggling with quality control and employee retention as they expanded from 3 to 8 locations. Traditional consulting would have recommended standardized training programs, detailed procedure manuals, and regular quality audits from corporate headquarters, I explained. Instead, we developed a storytelling-based training system that helped new employees understand not just what to do, but why. It mattered to the restaurant's success and their own professional development. Storytelling? James Crawford sounded skeptical. Instead of memorizing procedures, employees learned the story of the restaurant's values through interactive workshops. They understood how their role connected to customer satisfaction, how customer satisfaction connected to business success, and how business success created opportunities for their own advancement. I showed them the before and after metrics. Employee retention up 75%, customer satisfaction scores up 60%, average. Training time reduced from 6 weeks to 3 weeks. But the most important result, I continued, was that employees at each location started developing their own innovations for better customer service. They became problem solvers instead of procedure followers. Linda Brennan was studying the metrics with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades evaluating business proposals. "Jessica, these results suggest that your approach doesn't just solve immediate problems. It actually makes organizations more resilient and adaptable." "Exactly. Which is why I think Meridian and Henderson could be valuable partners for each other." "How so?" "Henderson has access to larger clients with more complex challenges than Meridian typically handles. But some of those clients' problems might be better solved with our immersive, human-centered approach rather than traditional consulting methodologies." I clicked to my final slide, which outlined a potential partnership structure. What if Henderson could offer clients a choice between comprehensive technology solutions and creative operational improvements? What if you had access to both traditional consulting expertise and innovative problem-solving approaches? Rebecca Martinez was leaning back in her chair with the expression of someone who was seeing new possibilities. "Jessica, are you proposing that Meridian would handle certain types of Henderson client engagements?" "I'm proposing that we develop a collaborative approach where Henderson's analytical expertise and Meridian's creative methodologies support each other." Some clients need what Henderson does best. Some clients need what Meridian does best. And some clients need both. Kevin. Wu looked up from his tablet. That would require a very different kind of partnership than we typically establish with consulting firms. What kind of partnership do you typically establish? Usually, we subcontract specific project components to specialist firms. We maintain primary client relationships and overall project responsibility. And how's that working for client satisfaction and retention? Marcus answered before anyone else could respond. Mixed results. Some clients are very satisfied with our comprehensive solutions. Others feel like we're solving problems they don't actually have while missing problems they do have. Linda Brennan was studying Marcus with interest. Marcus, you've been unusually quiet today. What's your assessment of this potential partnership? Marcus looked directly at me, and I could see him making a decision about how honest he was going to be with his colleagues. I think Meridian represents exactly what Henderson needs to stay competitive in a changing market, he said. Jessica's approach to problem solving is more effective than our traditional methodologies for a significant percentage of our client challenges. But more than that, I think working with Meridian could help Henderson's consultants become better at what we do. Better how? James Crawford asked. Better at understanding the real problems instead of just the symptoms. Better at designing solutions that work with existing organizational culture instead of trying to replace it. Better at helping clients become more capable rather than more dependent. The conference room was quiet except for the sound of Kevin Wu's fingers tapping against his tablet screen. I could feel the weight of this moment, the recognition that everything I'd built over the past 3 months was being evaluated by people who could either validate my approach or dismiss it as interesting but impractical. Linda Brennan closed the folder containing our case studies and looked directly at me. Jessica, Henderson and Associates would like to propose a 6-month pilot partnership. We'll identify 5 clients whose challenges seem suited to Meridian's approach, and you'll lead those engagements with Henderson support. At the end of 6 months, we'll evaluate results and determine whether to expand the partnership. I felt something electric run through my chest, the same feeling I'd had months earlier when David Chen had offered me the director position, but magnified by the recognition that this moment was changing not just my career trajectory, but my understanding of what I was capable of achieving. I accept, I said. Linda smiled. Excellent. Marcus will be your primary liaison during the pilot program. I assume you two can work together professionally? Marcus and I looked at each other across the conference table, and I saw something in his expression that looked like respect mixed with anticipation. I think we'll work together very well, I said. As I packed up my laptop and shook hands with the Henderson team, I realized that the real accountability hadn't been about proving my professional capabilities to them. It had been about proving to myself that I could succeed at the highest levels of business without compromising the creative problem-solving approach that made my work meaningful. Walking out of the Henderson building into the bright April morning, I pulled out my phone and sent a text to Catherine. The meeting went well. We should talk soon. Her response came back within seconds. I'm proud of you. 3 words that changed everything. 3 days after the Henderson meeting, Catherine called me at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. Not a text, not an email, but an actual phone call, which in our family meant either an emergency or something too complex for digital communication. Jessica, it's me. Do you have time to talk? I was sitting in my studio apartment, reviewing proposals for the Henderson pilot program, surrounded by whiteboards covered in project timelines and client assessment frameworks. The contrast between my cramped living space and the professional success I was building felt surreal, like living in 2 different realities simultaneously. I have time, I said, closing my laptop. I've been thinking about Sunday dinner, about what I said, how I said it, and what happened after. Catherine's voice sounded different. Not the polished confidence I was used to, but something rawer, more uncertain. It reminded me of how she'd sounded when we were teenagers and she'd gotten caught breaking curfew. What specifically have you been thinking about? I've been thinking that I don't know you as well as I thought I did, and I've been thinking that maybe I didn't want to know you as well as I could have. I waited for her to continue, using the same patient silence I'd learned to employ with clients who were struggling to articulate complex problems. Jessica, can I ask you something? When did you stop telling me about your life? The question caught me off guard. I'd been expecting an apology, maybe an attempt to smooth over the embarrassment of Sunday's dinner. I hadn't expected Catherine to want to understand how we'd gotten to the point where she could spend 20 minutes publicly describing a version of my life that bore no resemblance to reality. I don't think I stopped telling you about my life, I said carefully. I think I stopped telling you about my hopes. What's the difference? My life was what you already knew. Struggling artist, dead-end jobs, financial uncertainty. That was all true for a while. But my hopes were about what I thought might be possible if I could figure out how to use my skills differently. Catherine was quiet for a moment. In the background, I could hear Marcus talking to someone, probably on a work call. Why didn't you tell me about your hopes? Because every time I mentioned something I was excited about, you found a way to explain why it wasn't realistic. The gallery show that fell through, the photography client who didn't turn into steady work, the startup job that seemed promising. You were always quick to point out the ways those things were likely to disappoint. Me? I was trying to protect you from getting hurt. No, Catherine. You were trying to protect yourself from having to watch me fail again. There's a difference. Another silence, longer this time. You're right, she said finally. I was protecting myself. It was easier to assume you would fail than to hope you would succeed and risk being disappointed. This was more honesty than Catherine had offered me in years, maybe ever. I felt something shifting between us, the way tectonic plates must feel when they stop grinding against each other and find a new way to align. Catherine, can I tell you something about the Henderson project? Of course. Marcus isn't just my liaison for the pilot program. He's asked if he can be directly involved in the client engagements. He wants to learn Meridian's methodology so he can apply it to his other Henderson projects. I heard her intake of breath. He didn't tell me that. He probably wasn't sure how you'd react. But, Catherine, your husband is genuinely excited about changing how he approaches his work. He's been feeling stuck in traditional consulting frameworks for months. And he sees this partnership as an opportunity to become better at helping clients solve real problems. Marcus has always been good at his job. Being good at your job and finding meaning in your job aren't the same thing. Marcus is good at implementing Henderson's standard methodologies, but he wants to learn how to think more creatively about problem solving. Catherine was quiet again, and I could almost hear her recalibrating her understanding of her husband's professional satisfaction. Jessica, are you saying that Marcus is unhappy at Henderson? I'm saying that Marcus is excited about learning new approaches to consulting work. Whether that makes him happier at Henderson or helps him realize he wants something different, I don't know. But either way, he's grateful for the opportunity to expand his professional capabilities. And you're teaching him. We're learning from each other. Marcus understands large-scale organizational dynamics in ways I'm still figuring out. I understand human-centered problem-solving in ways that are new to him. It's collaborative. I could hear Marcus's voice in the background getting closer, then Catherine's muffled voice as she covered the phone to say something to him. Jessica, she said, coming back to the conversation, Marcus wants to talk to you. The phone changed hands, and suddenly I was talking to my brother-in-law for the first time since the Easter dinner revelation. Jessica, hi. I hope it's okay that Catherine called you. We've been talking about Sunday and about the Henderson project, and I wanted to thank you. Thank me for what? For handling Monday's meeting the way you did. For keeping it professional, despite everything that happened at dinner. For giving me the opportunity to work with you without making it awkward or complicated. Marcus sounded relieved, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy weight and finally gotten permission to set it down. Marcus, you don't need to thank me for treating you professionally. That's just how business works. I know, but Jessica, I need you to understand something. When I was evaluating Meridian for Henderson, I had no idea you worked there. But even if I had known, my assessment wouldn't have changed. Your company's track record speaks for itself. I appreciate that. But there's something else. Working with you on this pilot program, it's already changing how I think about consulting. Yesterday, I was reviewing a client proposal that our team had developed using our standard approach, and I found myself asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. What kind of questions? Questions like, are we solving the problem the client actually has, or the problem we're equipped to solve? Are we designing solutions that work with their existing culture, or are we requiring them to change their culture to accommodate our solutions? Are we helping them become more capable, or more dependent on expensive consulting services? I felt a surge of excitement hearing Marcus describe the same thought process that had led me to develop Meridian's methodology. And what did you discover? I discovered that we were recommending a 2-year technology overhaul for a problem that could probably be solved in 6 weeks with better communication systems and workflow redesign. What did you do? I called the client and asked if we could schedule some additional discovery sessions before finalizing our proposal. I told them I wanted to spend more time understanding their day-to-day operations before recommending solutions. Marcus paused, and I could hear him moving around, probably pacing the way he did when he was excited about something. Jessica, the client, was thrilled. They said that most consulting firms present solutions before really understanding their problems, and they were relieved to work with someone who wanted to dig deeper. That's fantastic, Marcus. But here's the thing. I learned that approach from studying your case studies, from seeing how you work with clients to understand their real needs instead of just their stated requirements. I heard Catherine's voice in the background asking Marcus to put the call on speaker. Jessica, Catherine said, I've been listening to Marcus talk about this project for the past 3 days, and I need to tell you something. What? I've never heard him this enthusiastic about his work, ever. In 6 years of marriage, I've never seen him excited about going to the office on Monday morning. Marcus laughed. Catherine's right. I've been good at my job for years, but I haven't been passionate about it. Working with you is helping me remember why I got into consulting in the first place, which was to help businesses solve problems they couldn't solve on their own. But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot that. Problems are human problems, not just operational problems. Catherine's voice was thoughtful. Jessica, is that how you've always thought about business consulting? It's how I think about any kind of problem solving. Whether I was making art or helping businesses improve their operations, the challenge is always the same. How do you understand what's really happening, and how do you create something better? But how did you know that approach would work in business? It was a good question, one that got to the heart of why my career transition had been successful despite my lack of traditional business training. I didn't know it would work, I said. But I knew that the problems businesses were describing sounded like problems I'd been solving my whole life, just in different contexts. What do you mean? When I was making art, I was constantly trying to take chaotic or broken elements and turn them into something coherent and beautiful. When I started working with businesses, I realized that organizational problems were just another type of chaos that needed to be understood and restructured. Marcus was back to pacing. Jessica, can you give us an example of how that translation worked? Sure. Remember the restaurant chain project I mentioned in the Henderson presentation? The training program I developed was based on techniques I'd used to help people understand art installations. How so? When I was curating gallery shows, I learned that people connect with artwork much more deeply when they understand the story behind it, not just what the artist intended, but why the work mattered to the artist's life and development. Catherine was following this closely. And how did that apply to restaurant training? Instead of teaching employees to follow procedures, I taught them to understand the story of why excellent customer service mattered to the restaurant's success and their own professional growth. Once they understood the why behind what they were doing, they became much better at figuring out the how in different situations. That's brilliant, Marcus said. You took a communication technique from the art world and applied it to employee training. Exactly. And that's what I mean when I say that problems are problems. The context changes, but the fundamental challenge of understanding complex systems and creating positive change remains the same. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had a different quality than I'd heard before. Jessica, I owe you more than an apology for Sunday dinner. What do you mean? I owe you an apology for the past 5 years, for assuming that difference meant inferior, for thinking that success only looked one way, for not being curious about what you were learning or what you might be capable of achieving. This was not the conversation I'd expected when Catherine called. I'd thought we might discuss the awkwardness of Sunday's dinner, maybe establish some ground rules for future family interactions. I hadn't expected this level of introspection or accountability. Catherine, I appreciate that. But I also need to acknowledge that I could have handled things differently. I could have been more open about my career transition, more willing to explain what I was working on even when it was still uncertain. Why weren't you? Because I was afraid that if I told you about my hopes and they didn't work out, you'd use my failure as evidence that I should have listened to your advice about finding more stable career options. And now? Now I think we both understand each other better than we did a week ago. Marcus cleared his throat. Jessica, Catherine, and I have been talking about having dinner next week. Just the 3 of us. We'd like to hear more about your work, and we'd like to tell you about some changes we're thinking about making. What kind of changes? Catherine answered. Marcus and I have been discussing the possibility of him transitioning away from Henderson eventually. Not immediately, but over the next year or 2. We think there might be opportunities for him to develop his own consulting practice using some of the approaches he's learning from working with you. This was a surprising development. Marcus had spent 8 years building his career at Henderson, and Catherine had made his position there central to how she talked about their success. What brought this on? I asked. Marcus responded. Working with you has helped me realize that I'm more interested in helping small and mid-sized businesses solve real problems than I am in managing large-scale technology implementations for Fortune 500 companies. And Catherine thinks that if I'm going to make a career change, now might be the right time to do it. Catherine, what changed your mind about the importance of established companies and traditional career tracks? Watching you succeed by doing exactly the opposite of what I thought was necessary for professional achievement. And listening to Marcus talk about his work with genuine excitement for the first time in years. I felt something warm and unfamiliar settling in my chest. For the first time in my adult life, Catherine was asking for my perspective rather than offering hers. I'd love to have dinner and talk about this, I said. But I want to be clear about something. If Marcus decides to start his own consulting practice, he shouldn't do it to copy what I'm doing. He should do it to build something that matches his own interests and capabilities. What do you mean? Catherine asked. I mean that Marcus has different strengths than I do, and he's interested in different types of problems. His consulting practice should reflect who he is, not who I am. Marcus laughed. Jessica, you sound like you're already thinking about how to help me figure this out. Maybe I am, but only if you're serious about wanting to do something different. I'm serious, Marcus said, and Catherine is too. Then let's have dinner and talk about what that might look like. As I hung up the phone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Catherine and Marcus. For the first time, they were asking me for guidance instead of offering it. For the first time, my professional expertise was being treated as valuable rather than interesting but impractical. But more importantly, I was starting to understand that the success I'd built at Meridian wasn't just about proving myself to my family. It was about discovering what I was actually capable of achieving when I stopped letting other people's expectations limit my sense of possibility. The redemption wasn't just for me, it was for all of us. 6 months later, I stood in front of the Henderson and Associates executive team for the final presentation of our pilot partnership. But this time, I wasn't alone. Marcus sat beside me, his own laptop open, ready to present the results of his first independent consulting project using the methodology we'd developed together. The same conference room that had once intimidated me now felt like a familiar workspace. Linda Brennan was in her usual seat at the head of the table, but the dynamics had shifted in ways I could never have predicted that April morning when I'd first walked through Henderson's marble lobby. Before we review the pilot program results, Linda began, "I want to acknowledge that this partnership has exceeded our expectations in ways we didn't anticipate. Jessica, your team has delivered transformational outcomes for all 5 client engagements. But Marcus, your adaptation of Meridian's approaches to Henderson's existing client relationships has been equally impressive." Marcus smiled, the kind of genuine expression I'd rarely seen from him during family dinners when Catherine would list his professional achievements. "Linda, I need to be clear that I didn't adapt Jessica's approaches. I learned from them. But what I've developed is something different. It's what happens when you combine Meridian's human-centered problem-solving with Henderson's analytical capabilities." I looked at Marcus with pride. Over the past 6 months, I'd watched him evolve from someone who was good at implementing other people's methodologies to someone who was creating his own approach to consulting. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. "Let's review the numbers," Rebecca Martinez said, pulling up a presentation that showed the combined results from our pilot program. Client satisfaction scores for Meridian led. Engagements averaged 94%, compared to Henderson's historical average of 78%. Implementation timelines were reduced by an average of 60%. And perhaps most significantly, client retention and referral rates have increased substantially. James Crawford was studying the data with the expression of someone who'd spent his career learning to recognize genuine success versus statistical manipulation. Are these results sustainable? We're not seeing short-term improvements that will regress once the engagement period ends? Actually, I said, clicking to the next slide. Our follow-up assessments show that client improvements have continued to grow after project completion. When you teach people how to solve problems rather than just solving problems for them, they keep getting better at identifying and addressing new challenges. Kevin Wu leaned forward with interest. "Jessica, can you give us a specific example of sustained improvement?" Pinnacle Electronics was our second pilot client. They came to us with inventory management issues that were causing customer service problems and cash flow challenges. Traditional consulting would have recommended new inventory software and revised procurement procedures. I pulled up photos showing Pinnacle's warehouse before and after our engagement. Instead, we spent 3 weeks documenting their existing workflow and interviewing employees at every level of the operation. We discovered that their inventory problems weren't caused by inadequate systems. They were caused by communication, gaps between sales, warehouse, and procurement teams. Marcus picked up the story. Jessica's team designed a visual communication system that let all 3 departments see real-time inventory status and upcoming demand. But the brilliant part was that they taught Pinnacle's employees how to adapt and improve the system themselves. 6 months later, I continued, Pinnacle has not only maintained their improved inventory accuracy and customer satisfaction scores, they've expanded the communication system to other areas of their business. They're solving new problems using the same principles we taught them. Linda Brennan was taking notes in the precise handwriting of someone who'd spent decades turning complex discussions into actionable decisions. And Marcus, tell us about your Henderson client results using modified approaches. Marcus opened his laptop and projected a different set of metrics. I've applied human-centered problem-solving techniques to 3 of my existing Henderson clients over the past 4 months. Instead of our standard comprehensive analysis, followed by recommended solutions, I started each project by spending extended time understanding the day-to-day operational reality. He clicked through case studies showing his work with a manufacturing company, a retail chain, and a technology startup. In every case, the real problems were different from the problems described in the initial client briefings. And in every case, solutions that worked with existing organizational culture were more effective than solutions that required extensive change management. Rebecca Martinez was comparing Marcus's results to Henderson's historical client satisfaction data. Marcus, your modified approach has generated the highest client satisfaction scores in Henderson's 20-year evaluation history. More importantly, Marcus said, my clients are referring new business to Henderson at twice our average referral rate. When you help businesses solve real problems effectively, they become enthusiastic advocates for your services. James Crawford was studying the combined pilot program data with growing amazement. What we're seeing here is that both Meridian's independent approach and Henderson's modified approach are delivering superior results compared to our traditional methodologies. Which brings us to the strategic question, Linda said, setting down her pen and looking directly at me. Jessica, Henderson would like to expand our partnership beyond the pilot program. We're prepared to offer Meridian a comprehensive strategic alliance that would make you our preferred partner for human-centered consulting engagements. The offer was everything David Chen and I had hoped for when we'd first started discussing the Henderson partnership. Guaranteed client referrals, access to larger projects, validation of our methodology by one of the Pacific Northwest's most respected consulting firms. But over the past 6 months, I'd learned something about success that I hadn't understood. When I was sitting at my grandmother's Easter table, the most meaningful achievements are the ones that create opportunities for other people to succeed, not just recognition for your own accomplishments. Linda, I'm grateful for Henderson's confidence in Meridian's work, I said. But before we discuss expanding the partnership, I need to tell you about some changes that are happening at Meridian. Kevin Wu looked up from his tablet with interest. What kind of changes? Marcus has decided to leave Henderson and join Meridian as a full partner. We're expanding our methodology to include the analytical capabilities and large-scale project management expertise that Henderson represents, but in a boutique firm structure that maintains our focus on creative problem-solving. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone in a room realizes they need to recalculate everything they thought they understood about a situation. Marcus cleared his throat. I've already submitted my resignation to Henderson. My last day is Friday. Linda Brennan was staring at Marcus like he'd announced he was joining the circus. Marcus, you're walking away from senior vice president at Henderson to become a partner at a consulting firm that didn't exist a year ago? I'm walking away from implementing other people's solutions to start creating my own solutions, Marcus said. Linda, I've learned more about effective consulting in the past 6 months working with Jessica than I learned in 8 years at Henderson. This isn't about leaving Henderson. It's about building something new that combines the best of both approaches. Rebecca Martinez was flipping through what looked like Marcus's personnel file. Marcus, you understand that you're giving up a significant salary, comprehensive benefits, and clear advancement opportunities. I'm giving up predictability to gain the opportunity to do work that actually makes a difference, Marcus replied. Rebecca, how many Henderson clients have told you that our solutions transformed their business in ways that exceeded their expectations? She paused, clearly thinking through years of client feedback. Honestly, very few. Most clients are satisfied with our work, but not enthusiastic about it. Exactly. I want to do work that generates enthusiasm, not just satisfaction. James Crawford was studying the pilot program results with new interest. If Marcus joins Meridian as a full partner, what would that mean for Henderson's access to your methodology? I looked at Marcus, And we had one of those wordless conversations that happen between people who've spent months learning to think collaboratively. "We'd like to propose a different kind of partnership," I said. "Instead of Meridian becoming Henderson's preferred vendor, what if we became Henderson's innovation lab?" "What does that mean?" Linda asked. Marcus answered. "It means that Meridian would continue to work independently, but we'd also collaborate with Henderson on developing new approaches to consulting challenges. We'd share our methodology with Henderson consultants who wanted to learn human-centered problem-solving, and Henderson would share their analytical frameworks with Meridian when we're working on larger-scale projects. A consulting partnership. Between equals," I added. "Not a vendor relationship, but a collaborative alliance where both firms benefit from each other's expertise." Kevin Wu was taking rapid notes again. "That's a very different model from anything Henderson has tried before." "Which is exactly why it might work," Linda said thoughtfully. "Jessica, Marcus, give us a week to discuss this proposal with the full partnership. But I'll tell you now that I'm intrigued by the possibility of Henderson learning new approaches, rather than just hiring specialists to handle unusual projects." As we packed up our laptops and said goodbye to the Henderson team, I realized that this meeting represented something much larger than a business partnership. It was validation that the approach I'd stumbled into accidentally, treating problems as human challenges rather than just operational obstacles, had value that extended beyond my own career success. But the real transformation wasn't happening in conference rooms or client sites. It was happening in my family. 2 weeks later, Catherine and I were having lunch at a small restaurant in the Pearl District, the same neighborhood where she'd once lived in a house that cost more than my annual salary. But now we were meeting as equals, two successful professionals discussing our respective careers with mutual respect and genuine interest. "Jessica, I need to tell you something," Catherine said, setting down her fork and looking directly at me. "Marcus quitting Henderson to join Meridian has been the best thing that's happened to our marriage in years." "Really? I thought you might be worried about the financial implications." Catherine laughed. "I was worried about the financial implications for about a week. Then I watched Marcus come home from work actually excited about what he'd accomplished that day, and I realized that money can't buy the kind of job satisfaction he's found working with you. He's found working with himself," I corrected. "Catherine, Marcus didn't become a different person when he joined Meridian. He just finally got the opportunity to use capabilities he already had but hadn't been able to develop at Henderson." "That's what I mean," Catherine said. "You helped him discover what he was actually capable of achieving. And watching that transformation has made me think about my own career differently. This was new information. Catherine had never expressed anything but complete satisfaction with her marketing career." "How so?" "I've been successful at my job for years, but I've never been passionate about it the way Marcus is passionate about his work now. I'm good at marketing campaigns, but I don't feel like I'm solving problems that really matter to people." Catherine was rotating her water glass between her hands, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood when she was working up the courage to ask our parents for something she wasn't sure they'd approve of. "What kind of problems do you want to solve?" I asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. But watching you and Marcus build something meaningful together has made me realize that maybe I should be asking different questions about my own career." "What questions?" "Questions like, what would I do if I weren't afraid of failing? What problems do I care about solving? Not just problems I'm technically capable of solving. What would meaningful work actually look like for me?" I felt something warm and unexpected settling in my chest. For the first time in our adult lives, Catherine was asking me for guidance about something that mattered to her, and she was asking because she genuinely valued my perspective. "Catherine, those are exactly the right questions to be asking. But you know that answering them might mean making some big changes." "I know. And a year ago, that would have terrified me." But watching you succeed by doing exactly the opposite of what I thought was necessary for professional achievement has helped me understand that security and stability aren't the same thing. What do you mean? I mean that real security comes from knowing you can solve problems and create value, not from having a prestigious job title and a predictable paycheck. You have more real security working at a 1-year-old consulting firm than I have after 8 years in corporate marketing, because you understand something fundamental about creating success rather than just maintaining it. This conversation was surreal. 6 months earlier, Catherine had stood up at our grandmother's Easter table and announced that I was a family burden who needed to accept reality and find a real job. Now she was telling me that my approach to career building was more secure than her traditional corporate success. So, what are you thinking about doing? Catherine smiled, and for the first time in years, she looked genuinely excited about something rather than just professionally satisfied. I'm thinking about starting a nonprofit focused on helping small businesses in underserved communities access better marketing resources. Not just advertising services, but strategic guidance about how to build customer relationships and sustainable growth. Catherine, that's a fantastic idea. Your marketing expertise would be incredibly valuable to businesses that can't afford traditional consulting services. Do you think so? I mean, I know I'm good at marketing, but nonprofit work is completely different from corporate campaigns. The technical skills are transferable, and more importantly, you'd be solving problems that actually matter to people's lives and communities. That's exactly the kind of meaningful work you were talking about. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had a different quality than I'd heard before. Jessica, would you be willing to help me think through how to structure this nonprofit? Not to do the work for me, but to help me ask the right questions about what I'm trying to achieve and how to get there? 6 months earlier, if someone had told me that Catherine would be asking for my professional guidance, I would have laughed. But sitting in that restaurant, watching my sister acknowledge that I had expertise she could learn from, I realized that the real success of the past year wasn't the Henderson partnership, or the Meridian expansion, or even the professional recognition. The real success was that my family had finally learned to see me as someone whose perspective had value, and I had finally learned to see myself as someone capable of helping other people solve meaningful problems. I'd be honored to help you think through the nonprofit idea, I said. But Catherine, I want to make sure you understand something. What? Building a nonprofit is going to be challenging in ways that corporate marketing never was. You'll be working with limited resources, unclear success metrics, and problems that don't have straightforward solutions. It's going to require exactly the kind of creative problem-solving that you used to think was impractical. Catherine grinned. Jessica, I'm ready to learn impractical problem-solving from the family burden who turned out to be the most successful consultant in Portland. As we walked out of the restaurant into the bright October afternoon, I realized that the woman who had been publicly humiliated at Easter dinner had become someone I'd never expected to be. The family member that others turned to for guidance about building meaningful careers and solving complex problems. The spray paint message that had started this whole story, "Thanks for the free ride, sucker," had been written by someone who thought they were taking advantage of kindness. But looking back, I understood that the real free ride had been mine. My family's low expectations had given me the freedom to discover what I was actually capable of achieving when nobody was watching or judging or limiting my sense of possibility. Sometimes, the best thing that can happen to you is being completely underestimated by the people whose opinions matter most. It forces you to figure out who you really are when you're not trying to meet anyone else's definition of success. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those people eventually learn to see you the way you've learned to see yourself. Not as someone who needs to be fixed or guided or worried about, but as someone who has something valuable to offer the world. The family burden had become the family's business consultant, career advisor, and reminder that there are many different ways to build a life worth living, And that transformation had changed all of us in ways we were still discovering. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.